Chapter 1. Chief Justice John Roberts. The air in the Supreme Court chamber hung thick with tension, a heavy, almost suffocating silence that mirrored the constitutional crisis brewing just beyond the marble walls. Outside, the nation stood at a precipice. Protests filled the streets, social media was a battlefield of partisan fury, and the three branches of government appeared locked in a titanic struggle for authority. Inside, Chief Justice John Roberts sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his hands folded tightly, his expression drawn with worry. He was a man who had spent his career trying to protect the court's apolitical image, to shield the judiciary from the increasingly caustic realm of modern politics. But the events of the past week had shattered any illusion of institutional detachment. President Trump's Truth Social rant, lashing out at federal courts for issuing injunctions against his executive actions and explicitly demanding the Supreme Court intervene, had sent shockwaves through every level of government. Calling the lower court decisions traitorous sabotage and demanding the high court restore the rule of law and the will of the people, Trump had forced the court into the center of the political storm. Roberts had convened this emergency meeting with a faint hope of finding consensus, or at the very least, a plan to de-escalate the brewing war between the judiciary and the executive branch. He wanted a reaffirmation of the constitutional separation of powers, a calm statement that could act as ballast amid the chaos. But as the justices sat before him, their expressions hardened, their words sharp. It became clear that the division within the court itself mirrored the one fracturing the nation. The chamber, usually a sanctuary of deliberation and respect, now crackled with barely contained ideological friction. On one side stood the conservative bloc, increasingly alarmed by what they saw as judicial overreach from progressive lower courts. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, sitting upright, his voice uncharacteristically raised, had already launched into a fiery defense of the president's position. "These injunctions," he thundered, "are based on flimsy legal arguments designed solely to obstruct President Trump's efforts to secure our borders and protect our citizens. This is not about judicial review, it's about sabotage. Radical left judges are exploiting procedural tools to paralyze the executive branch. That is not how the Constitution is meant to function." His words echoed in the hallowed hall, reverberating off the marble and centuries of tradition. To his right, Justices Alito and Thomas nodded silently, their body language speaking volumes. On the other side of the ideological divide, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson leaned forward, her tone calm but laced with steel. "With all due respect, Justice Kavanaugh, injunctions are a lawful, time-tested check on executive overreach. The courts are not saboteurs, they are the final safeguard for the vulnerable. When a policy disproportionately harms individuals without due process, the judiciary has not just the right, but the obligation to intervene." Her words were deliberate, unflinching. "These injunctions are not political acts, they are constitutional guardrails." The room split, philosophically and emotionally. Justice Elena Kagan nodded in support of Jackson, while Justice Gorsuch, leaning slightly toward Kavanaugh, tapped his pen against a yellow legal pad in thought. Justice Barrett remained quiet, her expression unreadable, a flicker of concern playing behind her eyes. Roberts looked down at his notes, the lines blurring for a moment as the gravity of the moment pressed down on him. He had hoped to avoid this, a full-blown institutional crisis, where even the highest court in the land could no longer pretend neutrality. As the debate deepened, the justices argued over not just legal theory, but the role of the court itself. Was it to be a guardian of rights, immune to public pressure and executive fury? Or had it become an unwilling participant in a broader political war, forced to choose between legitimacy and survival? Outside, camera crews waited, the media hungry for any hint of the court's response. Inside, history was being written, one argument, one fracture, one rising voice at a time. Chapter 2. "With all due respect," Justice Kavanaugh Jackson retorted, her voice sharp and unwavering, the tension in the room thickening as her words cut through it like a blade. "With all due respect, Justice Kavanaugh, these injunctions protect the rights of individuals facing potential deportation and ensure due process is followed. To ignore them is to disregard the very principles this court is sworn to uphold." Her tone, firm but passionate, made clear that this was not just a legal disagreement for her, it was a moral one. She spoke for the integrity of the Constitution, for the sanctity of judicial oversight, and for those who would otherwise have no voice in the process. Around her, the liberal justices sat in rigid solidarity, knowing the ground beneath their institution was shifting and that history was watching. Roberts, seated at the center of the ideological storm, ran a hand slowly down his face. He tried to mediate, tried to temper the rising tide of rhetoric, and bring the room back to a place of reason and measured constitutional debate. He appealed to their shared commitment to judicial restraint, to precedent, to the idea that the court should never appear beholden to political whims. "We are not an arm of the executive branch," he reminded them. "We interpret the law. We do not exist to enable or obstruct any president's agenda. We are here to preserve the rule of law, not participate in political theater." But his words, though noble, felt increasingly futile. The ideological divide had become a chasm. This wasn't just about law. It was about worldviews, about the very meaning of justice in a divided America. The vote was inevitable. The conservative bloc, led vocally by Kavanaugh and supported decisively by Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch, argued that the lower courts had overstepped. The power to enforce immigration laws, they said, resided with the executive, and unless there was clear evidence of constitutional violations, the judiciary had no business interfering. Barrett, after much quiet deliberation, joined them, tipping the scale. Roberts, despite his deep reservations and understanding of the disastrous optics, found himself bound by the will of the majority. He did not like it, did not like what it would signal to the public, to history, but he also knew that refusing to proceed would fracture the court even further. The decision was made. The Supreme Court would hear an expedited appeal of U.S. District Judge James Boasberg's injunction against President Trump's mass deportation plan, specifically targeting Venezuelan gang members, accused of affiliation with transnational criminal organizations. The implications were enormous. The legal community braced for a ruling that could redefine the limits of executive authority on immigration. Civil rights groups warned of a dangerous precedent. Conservative legal scholars celebrated the move as long overdue. Roberts, as he penned the court's procedural order, could feel the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. He knew the optics were terrible. The media would frame it as the Supreme Court, bending to Trump's will, as yet another domino falling in the politicization of the judiciary. The fragile facade of judicial impartiality, which he had spent so long trying to preserve, was now cracking under the weight of raw political momentum. The decision to take the case wasn't just a legal one, it was a symbolic one. To millions, it would appear as if the court had entered the battlefield of partisan politics. Roberts feared what would come next, not just for the reputation of the court, but for the country. Because once the public believed the judiciary had picked a side, even the truth would no longer be enough to convince them otherwise. Chapter 3. President Trump was pacing with barely contained glee. Meanwhile, in the White House, President Trump paced the length of the Oval Office with barely contained glee, the polished floors echoing beneath his measured, triumphant steps. The news from the Supreme Court had electrified him. He had long believed that the courts, particularly the highest one in the land, would eventually see reason and uphold his vision of a secure, sovereign America. Now, with the justices agreeing to hear the appeal against Judge Boasberg's injunction, he felt vindicated. He trusted the good people of the Supreme Court, men and women he saw as patriots, constitutionalists, guardians of law and order, not pawns of a political opposition that, in his view, had done everything possible to sabotage his presidency and threaten the safety of the country. Caroline Leavitt, his sharp, unflappable press secretary, stood nearby, arms folded, watching him with a calculated calm. She had been at the center of the administration's communications war for months, navigating crisis after crisis with a steely resolve that had earned her Trump's trust. But she also understood the delicate balance at play now. A Supreme Court case, especially one as high-stakes and politically radioactive as this, had to be approached with precision. The administration couldn't afford to appear as if it were bullying the judiciary or celebrating the court's involvement too overtly. Optics were everything, and Leavitt knew how to play this game better than most. "Mr. President," she said, her voice steady and deliberate, "we need to frame this carefully. This is not about interfering with the judiciary. This is about upholding the law and protecting American citizens from dangerous criminals. That's the message. That's what the American people want to hear." Trump stopped pacing, turning sharply to face her, a gleam lighting up in his eyes as her words landed. "Exactly, Caroline. Exactly," he exclaimed, pointing a finger in approval. The American people are sick and tired of these activist judges letting criminals roam free. This is about justice, plain and simple. This is about making America safe again. His voice rose with that familiar cadence, a rally tone, as if he were already back on stage before a roaring crowd, red hats waving, chants echoing. Leavitt allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She would shape the message into something bulletproof. This wasn't about political pressure on the court. It was about the Constitution, about public safety, about restoring the balance that activist judges had disrupted. The campaign ads were already taking form in her mind. He protected our borders. The left tried to stop him. The Supreme Court listened. The contrast was irresistible. Trump as the defender of law and order, the opposition as chaotic, lawless, and weak on crime. Trump resumed pacing, more slowly now, energized by the momentum. Let's make it clear, Caroline. This case isn't just about gang members. It's about who runs this country. Do we let unelected judges tie the hands of the president when he's trying to protect the people? Or do we let the American people decide who gets to lead? She nodded. We'll have the messaging ready before the networks spin it. Tucker's already asking for a quote. I'll feed him something clean and constitutional. Strong but not gloating. Trump laughed, rubbing his hands together. Good. Let's get to work. This is going to be big. And Leavitt knew he was right. The Supreme Court had taken the bait, and now the next battle in the war over America's future would be fought not just in courtrooms or campaign rallies, but in the hearts and minds of voters watching every headline, every quote, every televised argument unfold in real time. This was the kind of fight Trump thrived in, and she would make sure he didn't just survive it, he would win. Chapter 4. Leavitt and the White House legal team countered with arguments about national security. As the news of the Supreme Court's decision broke, U.S. District Judge James Boasberg sat in his chambers, eyes fixed on the muted television screen as the headline scrolled across the bottom. SCOTUS to hear Trump immigration case. Boasberg injunction under review. A cold dread crept into his bones. He had known this was coming, had felt the tremors weeks before when Trump's rhetoric intensified, and the political pressure mounted like an incoming storm. But now it was real. The highest court in the land, now firmly aligned with the president's ideology, had taken up the case. He was no longer just a federal judge presiding over a controversial matter. He was a lone figure at the center of a constitutional standoff between the judiciary and the executive branch. He was facing an uphill battle, and he knew it. Every instinct told him the odds were against him, that the political machinery surrounding the Trump administration was too well-oiled, too relentless, and too willing to bulldoze anyone who stood in the way of its narrative. But Judge Boasberg believed in the law. He believed in the Constitution, not as a symbolic parchment for speeches, but as a living framework designed to hold back the tides of authoritarianism and unchecked power. He wasn't naive. He knew the political winds were shifting violently, that public sentiment was inflamed, and that his name was already being dragged through the mud on every conservative news outlet. But it didn't matter. He was a judge, not a politician, and he was determined to fight. The legal battle that followed was nothing short of a whirlwind, relentless, high stakes, and saturated with political overtones. Boasberg's team of constitutional lawyers, civil rights experts, and immigration advocates launched a full-scale defense of his injunction, arguing that the mass deportations violated both domestic constitutional protections and international human rights obligations. They cited due process rights for asylum seekers, legal precedent protecting those fleeing political persecution, and the obligations of the United States under international treaties. They painted a picture of a nation turning its back on the most vulnerable, of a process that had been stripped of humanity in the name of expediency and control. On the other side, Leavitt and the White House legal team came prepared for war. Every argument was precise, every filing sharp and polished, every word framed with an eye toward both legal victory and public perception. They argued that the president, as commander-in-chief and steward of national security, had inherent constitutional authority to control immigration and protect the country's borders. They emphasized the growing threat posed by transnational criminal organizations like the Venezuelan-based TDA gang, the brutality of their tactics, and the failure of conventional law enforcement mechanisms to curtail them. They accused the lower courts, Boasberg included, of judicial activism, of substituting their own political judgments for executive action mandated by law. Cable news exploded. The case became the single most discussed legal showdown since Roe v. Wade. On MSNBC, pundits warned of creeping authoritarianism, of a Supreme Court capitulating to executive overreach. On Fox News, Boasberg was cast as a rogue judge, trying to thwart the will of the people and coddle criminals under the guise of legal formalism. Protesters lined the steps of the Supreme Court, some waving placards reading, "Judges protect rights," while others shouted, "Deport now." The American people were sharply divided. Some saw Boasberg as a constitutional hero, standing in defense of human dignity, while others saw him as a dangerous obstructionist threatening national security. Inside the courtroom, the arguments were fierce and historic. Lawyers on both sides cited landmark decisions, clashed over the boundaries of executive power, and wrestled with the legacy of past rulings on immigration, separation of powers, and human rights. The justices grilled them with pointed questions. Roberts, solemn and tight-lipped, asked about the long-term implications of courts interfering in immigration policy. Kavanaugh challenged the notion that procedural protections should override national security concerns. Jackson, forceful and eloquent, pushed back hard on the idea that mass deportation could proceed without individual assessments, calling it the antithesis of due process. And all the while, Boasberg watched from the sidelines, his name and judgment under scrutiny, his legacy on the line, and his belief in the rule of law tested in the highest court of the land. He knew he might lose. But he also knew that some fights were worth the cost, because in his heart, he believed this was more than a legal battle. It was a battle for the soul of American democracy. Chapter 5. Trump's actions were inflicting on American democracy. Behind the scenes, however, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Quieter, more private, but no less consequential than the courtroom clashes or the media firestorms. Inside the marble walls of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Roberts grappled with a storm of his own making. Increasingly uncomfortable with the growing perception that the court had become an extension of the executive branch, particularly under the shadow of Trump's aggressive immigration agenda, Roberts found himself in a lonely, perilous position. He had always seen the judiciary as the stabilizing force of American democracy, the last refuge from the tides of partisanship. But now, with the court poised to deliver a ruling that would either embolden Trump's power or fracture judicial authority, he feared the institution he had spent decades defending was on the brink of a legitimacy crisis. Roberts believed in secure borders. He understood the threat posed by transnational criminal organizations and recognized the president's broad authority over immigration policy. But he also feared the precedent the court was about to set, one that would not only validate mass deportations without individualized hearings, but also weaken the very foundations of due process. He worried that future generations would see the Roberts Court not as a guardian of the Constitution, but as the moment when the judiciary surrendered its independence to political will. It was in this moment of crisis that he found a surprising ally, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Though they had clashed in the past, though they came from different legal traditions and ideological leanings, Roberts began quietly sharing his concerns with her, engaging in a series of private, candid conversations that cut through the usual formality of the court. To his surprise, Jackson responded not with partisanship, but with an openness that disarmed him. She didn't press him to flip his vote or deliver a dissenting broadside. She simply listened, challenged him on the points where it mattered, and together they explored a path that could preserve the court's integrity without sacrificing national security. As the deliberations reached their climax and the justices gathered one final time before issuing a ruling that would define the balance of powers for decades, Roberts made a stunning move. Breaking from the expected 6-3 ideological split, he proposed a compromise, carefully worded, legally sound, but politically explosive. The court, he suggested, would uphold the legality of deporting Venezuelan gang members with documented criminal records, reaffirming the executive's authority to protect national interests. But in the same ruling, the court would mandate strict due process protections for all deportees, regardless of nationality or circumstance. Every individual subject to deportation under Trump's plan would be entitled to a fair hearing, access to legal representation, and judicial oversight. The room fell into tense silence as Roberts laid out the compromise. Kavanaugh frowned, flipping through his notes. Alito and Thomas exchanged glances. Barrett leaned forward, intrigued but cautious. And Jackson, expression unreadable, gave the slightest nod. It was a masterstroke of judicial statesmanship, threading the needle between two irreconcilable positions, reaffirming the rule of law without undermining national security. The decision that emerged from those chambers days later shocked the nation. In a narrow 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court upheld the core of Trump's mass deportation program, but with sweeping safeguards for due process that fundamentally altered its implementation. It was a win for Trump in the headlines, but a quiet reaffirmation of constitutional protections in practice. Roberts, once again, had defied expectations. He had pulled the court back from the brink and reminded the country and his colleagues that justice, at its best, wasn't about choosing sides. It was about protecting the principles that made the choice matter in the first place. Chapter 6. Trump, ever the pragmatist, declared victory. The conservative justices were furious. To them, Chief Justice John Roberts' compromise felt like betrayal disguised as moderation. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who had entered the final deliberations expecting a sweeping, decisive victory for President Trump, a full repudiation of what he and others in the conservative bloc deemed rampant judicial activism, was particularly incensed. He had argued behind closed doors that the court needed to send a resounding message that lower federal courts had overstepped, using injunctions as political weapons to obstruct the executive branch and subvert the will of the voters. He wanted clarity, finality, and unambiguous judicial support for Trump's immigration agenda. When Roberts instead proposed a narrow ruling that preserved the core of Trump's policy while embedding significant due process requirements, Kavanaugh viewed it as an institutional retreat, a capitulation to the political pressure bearing down on the court from the media and progressive circles. In internal memos, his language was sharp, accusing Roberts of preserving the court's public image at the cost of legal principle. Justices Alito and Thomas shared his frustration, and their eventual dissent reflected a deep ideological schism within the court. They warned that the majority's decision, though legally defensible, had failed to affirm the full extent of presidential authority over immigration and national security, potentially emboldening future judicial overreach. But Roberts, calm and composed, stood his ground. He knew the blowback would be intense, especially from within the conservative legal movement, but he also believed the court had to rise above the binary clamor of politics. In his mind, the compromise wasn't a retreat. It was a rescue operation, a means of pulling the court back from the brink of becoming a fully politicized extension of either party. By preserving the administration's ability to deport gang-affiliated individuals while simultaneously reinforcing constitutional protections for all deportees, he believed the court had upheld the law without sacrificing its legitimacy, and so, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court upheld the Trump administration's deportation authority, but with a critical caveat. All deportees, regardless of background, were now guaranteed due process protections, individual hearings, access to legal representation, and judicial oversight. The ruling sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Legal scholars on both sides rushed to interpret its implications. Media pundits spun the story in opposite directions, and the public, polarized, exhausted, reacted with a mixture of relief and frustration. It wasn't a total win for either side, but it was enough for the system to move forward. In the White House, President Trump took the ruling as a clear victory. Ever the pragmatist and master of messaging, he wasted no time in reframing the compromise as total vindication. At a rally in Tampa that evening, he took the stage to thunderous applause, his voice rising above the din of thousands of supporters. "The Supreme Court has affirmed my authority to protect our country," he roared, gripping the podium with characteristic force. "We're getting the bad guys out, folks. We're making America safe again. We're making America great again." The crowd erupted into chants of "USA, USA," as Trump beamed with satisfaction. To his base, the legal nuances of the ruling were irrelevant. What mattered was the headline: Trump wins Supreme Court immigration case. The optics were perfect, the narrative seamless. The images of strength and authority he had cultivated were reaffirmed in real time. Behind the scenes, Caroline Leavitt watched it all unfold with a knowing smile. As Trump's press secretary and one of the architects of the administration's messaging strategy, she had anticipated this exact moment. The compromise had been spun with surgical precision, the messaging honed and tested. They had weathered the backlash, outmaneuvered their opponents, and emerged not just intact, but stronger. The press releases had been carefully worded, the the talking points circulated to allies in the media, and the legal team primed to reinforce the interpretation that Trump had won outright. And in the end, they had succeeded. The court had not only allowed the deportations to proceed, it had forced the progressive opposition to accept a result they had fought tooth and nail to prevent. Stephen Miller, too, saw the victory as a masterstroke. As one of the chief architects of the administration's immigration policy, he had fought hard behind closed doors to preserve the substance of Trump's executive orders. Though he had initially bristled at Roberts' compromise, he now recognized the tactical brilliance of the outcome. By embedding due process into the policy, the administration had neutralized a major line of legal attack from immigrant rights groups while still achieving its core objective. The deportations would continue. The public would perceive strength. The opposition had been thrown into disarray, and the court, despite the bitter dissent from the right, had avoided a crisis of legitimacy. On Capitol Hill, reactions were mixed. Democrats issued carefully worded statements expressing disappointment in the court's decision to uphold the deportation authority, but claimed a moral victory in the reinforcement of due process. Progressives fumed at what they saw as a betrayal by the judiciary, while moderates tried to pivot toward other issues, eager to avoid being entangled in another polarizing immigration fight. Republicans, on the other hand, celebrated. Senate Majority Leader J.D. Vance declared the ruling a historic win for national sovereignty and the rule of law, while House Republicans promised new legislation to bolster Trump's policies. The political machinery roared back to life, with both parties spinning the outcome to rally their bases. But in that moment, as the dust began to settle, one truth stood out. Trump had won, not in a total, uncompromising sense, but in the way that mattered most. In the court of public opinion, in the headlines, in the momentum of a presidency that had refused to be derailed. The system, though bruised and battered, had held. The court had fulfilled its role, balancing executive power with constitutional oversight. And Trump, ever the fighter, had once again proven his uncanny ability to survive political storms and turn them into wind at his back. As night fell over Washington, the lights in the West Wing glowed late into the evening. Leavitt reviewed the next day's press briefings. Miller finalized internal policy directives, and Trump, surrounded by his most loyal aides, savored the quiet triumph. There would be more battles ahead. There always were. But tonight, they had defended their ground and emerged stronger. The court had ruled. The people had watched. And history, one way or another, had been made. For now, the country would move forward, not healed, but still intact. Its institutions stretched but not broken. Its divisions deepened but contained. Its leader triumphant, and its path uncertain. But one thing was clear. The Trump administration had navigated one of its greatest challenges yet, and had done so on its own terms. The victory was real, and in a city built on illusion, that was all that mattered. Let me know if you want this in a different tone or broken into sections for readability.